get started. As I said, it's the worst TUC got its founding. And this is just a picture of Tokyo Union Church, one of my first pictures of Tokyo Union Church after I got here, from a historic building across the street, where Omotesando sits. And I'll talk more about that in a later session. So the game plan today is I wanted to cover the first 3 chapters, Pastor Lee, if that's okay. Because earlier in the week, I wanted to do everything in today. I wanted to cover everything today. And then Friday, I think I will work on like deadlines. So adrenaline kind of. So Friday, I thought, okay, it's too much material. Let's do 2 classes. And then yesterday, as I was putting things together, I'm like, can I do 3 classes? Oh, sorry.
TBD.
TBD. Okay, sounds good. And so, but I think this is a good amount today. And then so how I've been running these workshops is from earlier on in the year, we kind of had 4 workshops in the spring, and then 4 workshops in the fall of every chapter that I wrote. Yeah, some of you have been at many workshops, for which I'm grateful. So the 3rd Sunday of every month, I did a little workshop, reading it for maybe half an hour. I got feedback, I incorporated that, and then I submitted a revision to the history committee by the end of every month. So that's what I've been doing the past year. And so yeah, back to lecturing. Before I did the workshops, I did 4 lectures on the first history book, Church for All Seasons, which was written by this gentleman, Robert Hemphill. He was with the Air Force, and he was also, I think he was an Air Force attaché at the U.S. Embassy, Mary, do you know? And then he was a president in the 1960s of TUC. Yes, we went around and did fun facts. Do you want to do a fun fact? You can pass.
Pass.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we'll cover the first 3 chapters, and then these 3 chapters are in some ways rewriting of the first book. How many people have read the first book? So yeah, I think my kind of prerogative when I got here was to write the 2nd volume from the 1980s, which I think I did. But then the first volume, history, I think is so fascinating when Japan opened to the world for the first time during Meiji Restoration, and then how Americans played an important role in rebuilding Japan after World War II. So I wanted to trace some of that history, so that's what I kind of do in the first 3 chapters. And then the book, Church for All Seasons, we have, it's very council elder kind of centric, and very pastor centric. So I wanted to write a book that incorporates more both kind of the political and cultural histories, broader kind of currents within Japan and the US, and also people's members' testimonies. Because TUC used to have a time for members to share testimonies. And I thought the book would be more interesting if both the microhistory of members' testimonies and kind of the macrohistory, both broader kind of national histories are included in addition to church institutional history. So yeah, so these chapters and each of these will be a page. And then feel free to stop me anytime, or we'll also have a time for question and answer at the end. So why did I start with Verbeck? Because as I was reading Guido Verbeck, how many of you have heard of this name? Okay, so it's these, yeah, that's the nerdy history geeky corner. Okay. Rich, you've read this chapter, no?
Yeah, I've heard of him because I've read this chapter, yes.
Okay, and then I kind of used his life as a way to talk about, give an overview of the history of TUC itself. Because I think his life captures in so many ways different demographics that will populate TUC over the years. And then I make an argument that like, I don't know if you agree, but you know, like, can you think of who the founder of this church is? Who would you say is the founder of this church?
Guido Verbeck.
Huh?
Guido
Verbeck. He was one of the founders. And I argue, you know, the Catholic Church has Peter, like Apple has Steve Jobs, and then the U.S. has George Washington. So I think it's good for a an institution, especially for an institution with as long of a history as TUC, to have a founder. So I think we could have had 5 founders because TUC began as a house church of 5 missionaries. But Isako told me Guido Verbeck is the most interesting, and then I agree. So that's why I kind of opened with his life. And 1830, he was born in the Netherlands, and he lives there for the first 22 years. And he studies engineering, and then he comes to the U.S., follows his sister, comes to the U.S. to make a fortune. But he experiences being born again while attending a Methodist revival. And so, and then he felt deeply moved, which led to repentance as a new preacher. And in the 1850s, he also suffers from cholera, and he promises God that if he survives, he will become a missionary. And he did survive, so he did go. And then everything kind of happens fast from there. Japan had just opened several years ago, 1853. Commodore Matthew Perry appears with 4 gunboats, and then Japan was given a year to open up. But Christianity was still forbidden then. And then on the top left is a monument to the martyrs of Nagasaki. In the 16th century, Japan had Nagasaki used to be called the Rome of Japan, and that region had 300,000 Christians, but they were all persecuted and many of them executed, so the church went underground. So it was after the treaty with the U.S., foreigners were allowed to practice religion, but they were not allowed to evangelize to local Japanese people. But he still came, and then everything happened fast. 1859, I think it was like March and April, he gets married, he gets ordained. And then in May 1859, he gets shipped off to Japan from New York City. And Panama Canal didn't exist then, so he went around South Africa via Hong Kong, which took half a year. So long journey back then. And then I love what he says about his first impression of Japan. He says, of all the commandments, the 5th commandment to, he's referring to 10 commandments here, the 5th to honor thy parents and thy mother is the only one that is strictly inculcated and observed, right? And you expect him to, I think he was a reformed minister, and then they can be a little bit strict, and you expect him to say something like, oh, and then everybody else is going to hell because they're not following the 9 commandments. But he goes on to say, and it is no doubt on this account that their days have been thus long upon the land which the Lord their God gave them. So more about Verbeck. This is his cemetery, and it's in Aoyama Cemetery, and the plot was given by the emperor, who paid for his funeral. And we actually went there this year. It was last year as a staff retreat. As director led us there. So who was Verbeck? He spent, after arriving in 1859, he spends a decade in Nagasaki. Nagasaki for 250 years during the Edo period was the only port city that was open to the outside world. The Dutch were the only people who were allowed to trade with the Japanese, and I think that kind of helped. Thank you. I think that kind of helped the Guido Verbeck endear himself to the Japanese because they're used to dealing with the Dutch people for 2.5 centuries. He worked as so before he could work as a minister and an evangelist, he worked as a teacher, translator, and advisor to the Meiji government. And some of his pupils include Okuma Shigenobu. I'm saying his name right. Do you know who this is?
Waseda
He founded Waseda University. And then Ito Hirobumi, a hugely important character in the history of Japan.
First the Prime Minister of Japan.
And then these were his students from Nagasaki. A lot of people, because Nagasaki was one of the first.
This one, just
That's right. Do you want to do a fun? Do you like to do a fun fact? We went around and did names and fun fact. So you can pass. Kathy passed.
Oh, fun fact. Oh, let's see. I may have to give me a moment as I arrive and quiet myself, but I'll come back to you.
Okay. Okay. You can have at the end of this slide, we'll really try to. But it's not And then Okuma says about Verbeck, that our teacher was extremely tender gentleman. And then what Verbeck brought was it was an encyclopedic, it was kind of a walking encyclopedia for the Japanese reformers who were especially interested in Western technology as a kind of way for Japan to keep its sovereignty in kind of an age of imperialism. And then Verbeck provided that because he had a training as an engineer. And then Iwakura mission of 1871, have you heard of this? It's also hugely important for the Meiji period and the opening of Japan. These were 100, I think, diplomats and students, right, who went around the world for 2 years.
Including 5 girls.
5 girls.
Suda Umeko.
Yeah, including Suda Umeko, who was a pioneer in women's education from the Meiji period, founded Suda University. And then she visited TUC also. There's a record of her coming to Union Church in Tokyo. And then this was his brainchild, it was his idea. And then Verbeck says, it is my hope and prayer that the sending of this mission may do very much to bring about, or at least bring nearer, the longed for toleration of Christianity. And then it did happen because 1873, Christianity does become legal in Japan. And then as I mentioned, that plot was given by the Meiji Emperor, and then he also became the first foreigner to receive the Order of the Rising Sun. So it was very much appreciated. And he actually didn't have a citizenship. I think something about him growing up in the Netherlands for the first 20 years, and then he lived in the US for about 6-7 years. But for whatever reason, after he had lived for a while, he became stateless. But then the Japanese government gave him a citizen, so he could travel back and forth between the US and Japan.
But he didn't have a passport. So he mentioned that my passport is in Japan.
So how do they let him into the United States without a passport?
I think the Japanese government gave him documents.
Documents.
So that's how much he was appreciated by the Japanese.
Okay, I have a.
Yes,
Okay.
okay.
Since we're dealing with significant people, the modern significant people that I have met here at Tokyo Union Church, well, I didn't meet him, but, as you mentioned in your book, Vice President Cheney, and all the security that came with that 1 week was, I'm more on the D side, the Democratic side, I wasn't so happy about that. But to counterbalance that, Delaware Senator Christopher Coons came, Chris Coons came on Easter, I can't remember what year it was, he and his wife, and he was so enthusiastic, and he joined the choir in the Hallelujah chorus. So that was really fun, because he was not just in the back row trying to hide, he was up front singing the Hallelujah verse. And then there was a boxer from the Philippines, does anybody remember that?
Manny Pacquiao.
Yeah,
Oh.
but he was in the back row trying to hide,
Yeah.
in the balcony, so. Those are the significant people I can remember since I've been.
Very good.
Yeah, I think Dan Quayle, who was a vice president of Bush, also visited here. And then I think
Korea.
Quayle visited, right? And then Dick Cheney, or Russell Gaslin told me, Russell was an elder here.
Yeah.
That a lot of the Americans wanted to serve union to their vice president, but Russell ended up being the one serving Dick Cheney.
That's great.
So,
And there were those of us who didn't want it, that's very bad. Okay, sorry.
yeah, there was the choppers flying, there was a sniper on the roof, a military ambulance outside just in case. Wow. High security time, so. But that's later on, we'll get there eventually.
Okay.
So Verbeck in TUC, he was one of the, he was the first trustee.
Right.
So Tokyo Union Church began with 3 elders, 1 trustee, and 1 pastor, and P.V. Veeder. Veeder was a Princeton Seminary trained minister, and then we've had a lot of Princeton Seminary people since then. It's a little Japan outpost of the seminary people. And in 1872, the first sanctuary in Tsukiji was built, which is, you might have seen this picture around. It's kind of a picture of the Sunday school in Tsukiji. And Isako, did you make this map?
I mean, not me, but yes, US Episcopal Licure, St. Paul's principal. I mean, he was also architect, so. He did it from a Tsukiji home and it's a Buddhist temple. And on top of the Buddhist temple, he build the 3D foreign settlement.
Okay.
And I just colored a little bit by myself.
I see.
It's an etching is the original.
I see. And then I guess, since you mentioned Buddhist temple, it was interesting that when Protestantism or Catholicism first came to Japan, they thought it was a form of a sect of Buddhism. And when Verbeck first arrives in Nagasaki too, he's living in a Buddhist temple. So there was this openness between religious traditions during this era. And then Verbeck and the pastor Viter are colleagues at the University of Tokyo. I think, or what became today's University of Tokyo. I think Verbeck was teaching maybe like algebra and ethics.
He was teaching what?
Algebra and ethics. Yeah.
Algebraic?
Algebra in mathematics sense and ethics. Yeah. So he would teach both STEM and humanities. And then I guess it's what I said earlier about I write that if one life could encapsulate the first century and half of Tokyo Union Church, Verbeck's 68 years may come close. Is why I choose to begin with him. And I will also mention I taught, so the primary record about Verbeck is actually written by one of the founding elder. You might have heard of this, William Elliot Griffiths. Do you know this guy? He wrote a lot about
From Rutgers University.
From where?
In New Jersey, Rutgers
Rutgers
University.
University. He wrote a lot of books about East Asia. He wrote one of the first famous books on Korea also. Korea came down in the 1880s. He wrote a lot about Japan. So and he still remains kind of the authoritative source. So it's like a one TUC elder writing about a TUC trustee. But unfortunately, we don't have much records of TUC's early years because there was a fire in the clerk's house in 1927, and then 1945, the church is bombed again. So we actually don't know too much about what they did and said, but we do what we can. And then Verbeck was a polyglot. He had like 4 mother tongues of Dutch, English, French, and German. German he called his heart language. And then he obviously became fluent enough in Japanese. He learned Chinese. He thought you have to learn Chinese to learn Japanese. So he spent a lot of time learning Chinese. And I think he could read like a Greek, Hebrew, like Latin also. So he was very much a polyglot, which we are also. And in 1955, I have this table in the next slide. But about 70% of the church was American, 6% Canadian, 8% Japanese, 9% European, and 5% Asian. And then if you think about today, we have a Japanese majority in the congregation, but we have more than 40 nationalities. And then Julie Fukuda told me how she loves hearing all these different languages during coffee hour, and how that come up with diverse linguistic pretty since then. And I also thought, Pastor Lydia, what language do you speak growing up?
Nyanja.
Nyanja. Okay, so maybe I wrote this before you came, but when Jimena was here, the mother tongues of, there were 5 people on the pastoral team, where none of us grew up speaking Korean, English at home. Yeah, so if our English is bad, please excuse us. And then so Verbeck was like a huge translator, especially before he could work as a missionary. He translated into Japanese the Code of Napoleon, and then constitutions of Europe and America and other legal documents that the Japanese reformers found helpful in framing their own constitution of 1889, some Meiji constitution that was majorly revised after World War II, but this was a fairly progressive constitution for its time. And then Verbeck also gets involved with the first Japanese Bible. He translates the books of Isaiah and Psalms, which has an important impact on the development of modern Japanese literature also. And that tradition is kind of continued by this pastor named Leighton Holmgren. He was an acting pastor at TUC after World War II, and he may have been like the biggest rock star pastor that TUC has had, because he became the head of the American Bible Society, and under his tenure, the society distributed more than 300 million Bibles. And so yeah, that's him meeting John Paul II. And then he also meets Jimmy Carter. There's a picture of him meeting with Jimmy Carter also. But also the interesting thing about that is, like, if you look at New York Times or LA Times obituary of him, it says he was survived by his companion of 30 years named Kiyoshi, which I hear is a man's name in Japan. So we might have had a queer pastor in the past. And Sen Nishiyama is obviously another TUC alum. He served the church. He came here in the 1930s, Japanese American born in the US, but he ended up serving the church for more than 6 decades in various roles. And he became a household name in 1969 for his simultaneous interpretation of the Apollo 11 moon landing.
Right.
And I think this is the last slide of first chapter. So Verbeek in politics, I guess I've mentioned how he was an advisor to the Meiji government through all the students that he trained over the years. And in 1959, more than 10% of TUC's members worked at an embassy. I think many of them in the US embassy, but in other embassies like Canadian and Australian also. And then this is on the left, I don't know if you can read, is for the 90th anniversary of TUC. And you can see the presiding chairman of the anniversary committee is a Canadian ambassador, William Wu. And then Edwin Rashauer is, who was an important, not only, he was J.F. Kennedy's ambassador to Japan, but also a donor of, I think he might have founded the Japanese studies at Harvard. So an important academic also. He kind of gave a speech about the old Union Church parishioners' view, even while he was an ambassador. So his parents were both elders at this church. His parents were missionaries, and he stayed involved with the church. Although I'm not sure if he identified as Christian, he really kind of went to university and did his own thing. But he still maintained ties with UC that he grew up in. And then there's another U.S. ambassador, Mike Armacost, which have any of you met him here? I think he came here in the 90s.
I talked to him over the phone when he retired to the California, famous university in California.
Yeah, he was,
Stanford.
he was one of my professors in grad school.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't know if you came across him, but he was pretty elderly at that point.
Yes.
He was very elderly, and there was a 4 people team teaching class, and sometimes he'd fall asleep during class. But when he did speak, he had so much to offer.
I was asked him to have an interview from a Japanese TV. And I called him on the phone, and 村上さん、大変失礼ですが、原稿を先に読まないといけない。インタビュー1週間しかありません。Within the 1 week, he couldn't have an interview. We have to send a draft 1 month before. So he was refused to have an interview with me. 全部日本語。Fluent Japanese.
Really?
Yeah, so we've always kind of been a church of like the diplomats and kind of the political class in the US, and I think we can even do more actually. The American Church in Paris after 9/11, I think it was Sarkozy, the French president came to an interfaith service at the American Church in Paris. So yeah, I guess we're not as like directly affiliated with America anymore. We don't have the US in our name, but since we have a lot of like the US fund, and if there is a national tragedy or something like that, I think this could be a place where we hold memorials. And then I think of Kathy Masui, who was an elder at TUC, now a member. She's kind of in that tradition of TUC members getting involved with politics. She was a financier, but she did an important research on women's economic participation called Womenomics, which was picked up by the Japanese government, by Shinzo Abe. So, and then what Verbeek says about, I mean, this is about art, but it's also politics. I like how he says, Reformed Christianity touches and creates art, literature, philosophy, and ideals, individual, social, and national. It reveals anew in Christ Jesus, he says. And then Rashauer also in the 1960s, he comes back to TUC to be in a panel about 1960s was a revolutionary time. And then the title of the panel was the Christian leaven in like the revolutionary times, right? How do we as a Christian navigate this politically turbulent period? So yeah, I think especially in the 60s we had a kind of tradition of wrestling with hard political, social questions and challenges. Okay, so chapter 2. Any questions about chapter 1 and Birkbeck?
You had his cemetery, his tombstone. Where is that?
It's in Aoyama Cemetery,
Okay.
and then there's a place for foreigners. It's like you go-
外人墓地ね、we used to call it.
Yeah,
Aoyama.
yeah, you go towards Rogongi, and then you turn left, and it's about halfway on
Yeah.
the street towards Daimai.
Okay.
And so, yeah, we can go pay our tribute. I don't know where the other 4 are buried. I don't know.
Yeah, some are somewhere in Aoyama Gaijin Mochi too, I think.
Okay, yeah, I think for me one founder is enough. So, okay, let's go to chapter 2. So I guess chapter 2, I more explicitly revisit the first book. And then I begin with Hugh Wilkinson because he kind of, for me, is the bridge almost between the last book and then the present book. So when I got here in August 2024, and he was the most senior member of the congregation. And I wanted to meet him. Noriko told me he was a Cambridge-educated code breaker who sipped tea with a Kiran Afra. So he kind of loomed larger than life, but he was too ill to have a visitor when I got here. So I kind of begin with that, how in December 2024, the pastoral team discussed. So choosing the most senior member of TUC who reads the Gospel of John. Well, in the beginning was the Word, and then the Word was with God, and the Word was God during the Christmas Eve service. This year it was Julie Fukuda. But we're wondering if he would be healthy enough to continue doing so, and he ended up not doing it. And then 2 months later, he passes away, aged 98. And then Pastor Hector, I, and Peter Matthews go to his house in Hiro and pick up boxes and boxes of books, which he gave. And during Lent of 2025, we had a memorial service for you. And but I heard, so I never got to meet him in person, but I still hear stories about him. And then he wrote an autobiography, which I think Peter Matthews might have helped type up. He was computer illiterate. So I learned about it through there. And he was, during high school, he was exposed to, he was introduced to moral rearmament movement of Christian fellowship. Have you heard of MRA? What can you tell me about it?
Not a lot. Not a lot. No, I don't know a lot about it, but I know it was a big deal
Yeah.
in the city. Yeah.
Yeah. And he travels from, English, he's born in India, he's English, and then he travels, I think he goes to Sri Lanka, Australia, and Hong Kong before coming to Japan. But he meets MRA missionaries everywhere he goes. It almost functioned like a denomination. I feel like the 20th century was a 20th century movement. So he becomes part of that. And in 1944, when he's 18, he gets a draft letter from the British military intelligence. And by then, he had a classic scholarship to Cambridge. So they wanted to learn Japanese to decode the Japanese naval messages that they intercept. So he goes, learning Japanese begins with like naval Japanese. And he plays this role. And by Christmas Eve of 1945, Hugh lands in Japan. And then he's on the back of an American army truck going from Yokohama to Tokyo. This is half a year after the war ended, 4 months after the war ended rather. And he writes, the whole way we passed scenes of utter devastation, just rubble and twisted metal until we arrived in Marunouchi. Marunouchi is the area between the palace and the Tokyo station. So as you can see here, Tokyo was absolutely flattened after World War II. TUC burned, TUC was bombed along with, and then 200 of Tokyo's 500 churches were bombed.
More people died in Tokyo firebombing than in Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
Yeah. So it was devastating. But by Christmas, and then 1945 of Christmas is when Hugh's autobiography intersects with Church for All Seasons, the TUC's first history book, because TUC's first history book mentions Yugo Nakada. He was a son of a famed Japanese evangelist. He used to be called Juji Nakada or something. It was called the Dwight Moody of Japan. Of the Japanese Holiness Church, but Yugo Nakada actually is a falling out with his father and his father's denomination, and he finds a home at Tokyo Union Church as a music director for many years.
Choir member Umezu-san, Mr. Umezu's fathers and grandfather of the Holiness Church in Japan. And they are prosecuted by the Japanese government.
Okay.
Most worst.
I
So
see.
he knows the prison system. If you are interested.
In Umezu,
Yeah, quite.
he attends our church.
Yes.
And then Yugo Nakada was a renowned hymn writer in his own right. And then he conducts the Messiah concert in Hibiya in 1945. And then Hugh goes there. It's Hugh's first introduction TUC. And then he also meets there a singer who he becomes choir members with in the 1960s after he moves to Japan. And this was TUC after the bombing. So we just had a little bit of the facade left.
So we have one thing left, our,
Offering.
Offering, yeah, I actually get to it later, is that, yeah. And 1967, Hugh moves to Tokyo, and then through MRA connection, he gets a job at Aoyama Gakuen. And he joins the choir, and then you start to see his names. And he wrote in his autobiography, I sang in the choir there as a pillar of the basis until he became deaf and lost my sense of pitch. I think, I don't think we actually have any choir members here, because choir meets at this time. But I think there are many members of the choir who have sung with Hugh Wilkinson. And 1970s, he becomes the president of TUC Choir and leader of the Young Adult Bible Study for Japanese. For those of you who know Michiko, who was a spiritual life elder, her introduction to TUC was through Hugh's class. And 80s, he serves on the stewardship committee, and then 1990s, he writes a lot in TUC devotionals. And I like what he wrote about peace here. He writes, we are living in an age that is desperately seeking for peace and not finding it. Jesus' peace is not the peace that the world gives. It is a serenity of mind, the being at peace with oneself that comes from attuning oneself day by day to the mind of God. And in 2022, we have a record in the church that he donated more than 1 million yen for us to purchase new hymnals. So what we have maybe, what we are reading now in the Beach Generation. And that's with Richard Mann. He ran the Koinonia magazine. I think this was around 2018. And the next, I kind of focus on 3 leaders that one really mentioned. They were either the president of the congregation at TUC or the chair of the board at TUC, because I think they really model for me how what like a Christian way to be American looked like during these like times of post-war occupation. So after World War II, Japan is ruled by a foreign army for the first time in its history. The U.S. occupation. It's supposed to be the Allied forces, in commander of Allied powers, but it's basically the U.S. that holds all the shots. And there's just like an iconic picture of MacArthur with the Emperor Hirohito, and then it wasn't clear whether the U.S. will maintain the Emperor system. So, but I think the U.S. decides the Emperor system is helpful for, is important for Japan. So that's maintained. And so I profiled 3 kind of TUC leaders. And first one being Russell Durgan. He was a board chairman from 49 to 50, and in 1919, he first comes to Japan to work with Tokyo YMCA at the age of 27. So I think YMCA these days is just like sports, right? But back then, I think, especially when there wasn't widespread public education, it was also an important school for many people, and an important kind of window into the Western world for many Japanese folks. A lot of social programs that they had also. And then Russell was an advisor to the Japanese Olympic committees of 1932 and 36. Japan was supposed to host 1940 Olympics until the war. And during the war, Durgan remained, there were a few TUC members who remained in, Paul Mayer also, who was the president of the congregation, and they decided to stay in Japan. Durgan does so because he's in charge of overseeing aid to prisoners of war, to American and British prisoners of war. And his obituary in 1956 says Durgan was a pioneer of boys camps in Japan, as he helped to reorganize the Japanese youth groups and student activities along democratic lines. And later on, he becomes a lecturer at Yale, and he received the Order of the Sacred Treasure from the Emperor for all his services to Japan. The next guy I talk about is Glenn Bruner, who was a chairman in 1952. And in 1920, he also comes as a young man, 23-year-old Methodist missionary to Nagasaki. But then the Great Depression hits in 1929, and he finds a job at the American consulate. And then when war begins in 1945, he was working at the American consulate in Taipei. Taiwan was a Japanese colony and was sort of part of the Japanese Empire, and he gets interned in Tokyo with other diplomats. And then I kind of feel like Japan shouldn't release these people during war, because all these like missionaries that get interned and get thrown out to the US, they join the military intelligence, because they know so much about Japan. But after the war, he becomes one of the first TUC members to come to the sanctuary, and then Catherine, what we were talking about, the Church Express collection. And then that's become like buckets and buckets of slag. But we did have an offering plate that survived the war. And then he also becomes an interpreter for American Hospital for Atomic Bomb Victims. We can debate whether the nuclear bomb was necessary to end the war, but he's actually doing something about it, which I really respect. And then he joined the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission of the National Academy of the Sciences in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he teaches at International Christian University, which was founded by MacArthur, and a Japanese crown prince too. So, and then the last gentleman I focused on is William Woodard. I actually came across him through this book. If you go to the bookstore that you went to, what's the Tsutaya. It's Tsutaya. And this is probably the most popular introduction to Shintoism in English. And it was written with William Woodard, because Woodard, after he comes first in 1921 as a missionary for the Japanese Congregational Church, and he serves in Sapporo, Seoul, and Seoul was a part of the Japanese Empire then also. So he serves in these places from ages 25 to 45. And again, the war erupts, and he joined the US Navy as an intelligence officer. And what he does after the war is hugely important, because he becomes the director of research in SCAP's Religious and Cultural Resources department. So the US, I think during the war, I don't know so much about Shintoism, but during the war, I think a lot of these Japanese religions were mobilized to support the war mobilization, especially kind of Shintoism with the emperor at the top. He really leads the effort to kind of engineering may not be the right word, but anyways, to ensure that these Japanese religious traditions would not be utilized for war again. So he does hugely important work there, and then he has an academic book in 1972. It's the Allied Occupation of Japan, 1945 to 52, and Japanese religions, which kind of established his reputation as a leading scholar on religions in the occupation period. And then in the book, he writes a popular book also. And he's on the left here. This is Mr. Woodard here. And this is actually 1950s. And then the gentleman here is the head of the central bank in Japan. So I think that kind of speaks to how TUC was becoming a church of like industrialist nature, business skills, and then government folks. And then this Araki is his name, the governor of the Bank of Japan, and he said Japan lacks religious consciousness. And he emphasized the need for religious and spiritual guidance in Japan's national life, and he was addressed at the Union Church's Men's Association dinner last night. And that's Pastor Russell on the right, and Buddha on the left, and other two. And then a book that Dr. Cotter made me read for my CompTIA's exam, for which I'm grateful. A book to kind of help, I think this book really contextualizes how we can think about our forefathers and foremothers, our spiritual kind of ancestors who were missionaries. Because even as late as 1955, about almost half of the congregation were missionaries. I mean, this number halves during the 1950s. But I guess Captain, you came as a missionary too. Right? So David Hollinger, he's a retired professor of history at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, and he says between 1886 and 1920, more than 10,000 young Americans became missionaries through the student volunteer movement. And by 1925, missionaries in Japan numbered more than 1,000. And then during these decades, being a missionary was considered one of the most honorable and widely admired of callings. I think unfortunately these days it's like becoming a banker or a consultant to a lawyer. But back then it was a missionary. And then between 1860 and 1945, this was before we had like an anthropologist, and this was kind of before we had foreign correspondents. So these missionaries are serving as proto-journalists and anthropologists. And he also makes an interesting point how America learned about Europe. I mean, America has always been like a more transatlantic civilization, but how America learned about Europe is during World War II, a lot of the European intellectuals fled to the US. Is how the US learned about Europe. But for Asia, it's these missionaries who went back and then really taught Americans about Asia. So the subtitle of this book is How Missionaries Try to Change the World, but Changed America. And an example of that is when Edwin Rashour, our Sunday school kid alum, was installed as head of the military language training program in Washington, D.C. He found that all his colleagues are either missionaries or kids of missionaries. Because if you think about back then, there were merchants and diplomats, and then missionaries are the kind of the people who go overseas. Like merchants just want to make money, right? As long as you can trade, they're happy. They don't really need to know the culture. And diplomats, I think you need to know a little bit more about the culture, local culture and politics. But if you want to win people's souls, you really have to know where they're coming from. And so missionaries were very invested in learning about other cultures during this period. And then I end this chapter with Wally, because he kind of fits in that like mold. And so at the end of 2025, he is the most senior member of TUC. He was a year younger than Hugh. I had a chance to visit him twice. It was Genki last time I went. And then he studied mathematics, and he loved taking photos. And then there are several books of photography published that Wally worked on. And then Wally also worked with the American Navy and the Air Force as an analyst in Washington, Taiwan, and Japan. And then when he was stationed at the naval base near Tokyo in the 50s, he first stumbled upon TUC. And then he bought this booklet called The Week in Tokyo, and someone advertised it for TUC. And he says once he arrived here, he instantly knew this was going to be his church, because of its combination of dedication and competence had a lot of appeal. He says 1960 he gets married here, and you can kind of trace what people are doing through these like bulletin announcements. 1965 February bulletin says, Tokyo Union never enjoys saying goodbye to those who leave, but we do want to say thank you to Mr. Wally Higgins for his loyal service as the chairman of the Adult Dedication Committee to the church. He goes back to LA for a bit, and then he says he loves like living around the Pacific, living by the ocean, but he was living on the wrong side. So he comes back to Tokyo. And then by 1980, we see his name again in the donated lilies for the Easter service. And this was kind of an interesting statistic from that kind of chronicles church's changes in the 1950s. So 1950, between 55 and 59, we actually become more American. We become 70% of the congregation, so 80% of the congregation. And then the percentage of Europeans decreases. And then Asians are pretty like a minority. And the Japanese are minority too. Japanese are only 8% of the congregation in the 1850s. And as I mentioned, you can see how we were like a huge missionary church in 1955, kind of how we were founded, but that shifts a lot during the 1950s. The percentage of missionaries halves, the embassy people, we have more embassy, business, and military people, so kind of a proportion of these people rises. And we've always had more women than men. I don't know if this is still true, but it's still true.
Right?
Okay, yeah, and during the 1950s. And it's funny that you kind of, they count young people separately. So,
White peas.
that's Wally, and this is the last slide of chapter 2. And so Wally ends up, he works he becomes an advisor for Japanese railways, and then he's part of like the Shinkansen opening in the 1960s also. And then he gets a job 60 kilometers northeast of Tokyo in Tsukuba. And then he lives 160 kilometers, like 100 miles southwest of Tokyo in Shizuoka, because his wife family is from there. So he's always commuting back and forth. And then he says TUC was halfway point for him. So he commuted 3 hours to go to church. And, but he liked riding trains. He really liked riding trains.
So yeah, free pass by JR.
I see it's a lifetime. And I guess fun fact, Gene Wilson did the voice for many of the Shinkansen
Right.
lines. Gene Wilson was a three-time elder. I'll talk about her in the next section. And then like Wally always has these like witty responses for like why he does what he does. He says after the elder for communication at TUC left for Singapore, he said he stepped in because Shizuoka is closer than Singapore. And then he says when the outreach ministry needed an elder, he signed up because he knew the locations of many of the organizations that TUC supported through his extensive travels. He worked on TUC used to have this like a directory with the photos of everybody and then with everybody's addresses and phone numbers. That was the age before social media, the age before stranger danger. Wally worked on a lot of these. And then Wally also kind of organized the archive, TUC archive, so I'm very grateful to him. I wouldn't be able to do what I do without what he put in. And I kind of wrap up here with, so Wally's been here since like, the 50s, right? He's kind of witnessed the transformation. And he does say that in recent history, after the tsunami, earthquake, and then the other troubles, the church's membership is reduced, and then we're forced to downsize our worldwide outreach. He says it did make a difference in what we can do and who we honor. And that's kind of the theme that Pastor Steve mentions also. And okay, I had chapter 3 that I mentioned, Joe and Yuriko's, I'm working this, but I don't think I have time. Do people, okay, I think I guess we can maybe stop here and maybe I'll continue from the next slide. Do people have questions about the last chapter?
Do you happen to have a photo collection from Wally?
I got his books
About
photography.
he published many books for the trains or stuff like that, or old Tokyo downtown. Any TUC, old TUC photos?
Yeah, I think there was actually one picture of Omotesando that he took. You've seen this?
Yeah, yes, okay.
You've seen it also. And then Omotesando didn't have, it wasn't like a luxury shopping district that it is. It was pretty residential, a lot of like the low rises. I think we're just like a suburban church back then that became super urban.
Joe, I'm curious, you said there were more women than men in the congregation. When did TUC appoint its first woman elder?
Oh yeah, when we get there. Oh no, it's in chapter 4, 1986. Margie Rinker. Does that name ring a bell? Anybody? Margie Rinker was, I think, her name. So, yeah, and then we've had associate pastor, female associate pastor since 1970s. Barbara Jenkins, who was actually the longest serving associate pastor. She served for 7 years. Yeah. And then we've had a series of associate pastors who are, Lutherans, Barbara Lund, Marty Wilkelson. I think I'll end here. Any other questions? Thank you all for coming, and I'm sorry I thought I could do it in 2 classes.
Can we have another class to go through?
Yeah, I think I'm going to get through it. Oh, I want to.
We want more
Yes,
More?
yes.
Okay, I think as long as someone comes, I'll keep doing this. When people stop showing up, I'm done. So, yeah, we have to look.
No, I'll join your third class,
Oh,
please.
wow, okay. Yeah, Isaac knows a lot about TUC's early years in PC, so. And Dr. Carter knows a lot about history of American Christianity.
Can you
so-
stay a little longer?
Like,
Or come back, please.
Yeah.
Of the period of what I covered, what can you tell us? What were kind of how as an historian of American Christianity, where does Tokyo Union Church fit within like the broader currents of American religious history? Do you think?
I mean, in the period you covered today, this is a period of like, in the U.S., it's a period of like massive expansion in the worlds of the kinds of Christian worlds that would have powered a church like this, right? So, kind of it's the heyday of ecumenical Protestantism, which is I think how I think about this church. It's a interdenominational, and in the U.S., these mid 20th century decades are periods where that world is at its peak power and peak prestige, and really kind of running their U.S. and really invested in world events as well. It's a world that's really thinking critically in new ways about missions and ministry and whatnot, but still deeply engaged both in the U.S. and around the world and kind of running the show in a way. So I would think a church like this one in Tokyo would be an outpost and a place of a hub for the kinds of folks who in the U.S. are really at their peak power. Yeah, well, there's lots to say about that. Yeah.
And what do we do after the decline of peak power?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think it's an interesting time for the worlds that this church has been a part of in the U.S. They are much diminished in their cultural cachet from these decades, but I teach at a seminary that's in these same worlds, and it's an interesting time. We're not going to keep doing everything we have been doing, but it's an interesting time for creativity and new life to come out of even the things that are dying.
Pastor Director Catherine, do you want to pray us out?
I do. I want to say how much we appreciate you and what a great job you're doing. This is a bit of an outgrowth of our 150th anniversary, where we're like, what's going to happen when no one knows what's happened here since the 80s? That's really sad if we just drop everything. And so we saw this as a direct miracle from God in our admin meeting when Pastor Steve was here, and we were looking, and we called a guy who was interested before in writing our history, and for some reason he wouldn't even talk to us anymore. I don't know what happened.
I thought I was the only one.
No, he was years before, and we thought, let's go back to him, and like he wouldn't talk to us anymore. So we're like, wow, that's discouraging. So we were having an admin meeting or a meeting with just the pastor, and your text came in that you were interested, and we're like, God, this is an answer. This is a really a miraculous answer to have the right person who's passionate, who has your journalism skills, but your seminary background. It was truly a miracle for us.
Thank you, Dr. Carter, for
This is all to say, forgive him for anything he didn't do. Please. And then I shared this with a very, very important advisor, one of our alumni, who really helped us a lot. and Julie Voskuil. And after she read the draft she's like, I love Tokyo Union Church even more now after reading that draft. So we wanted an accessible history, a lively history, historical history, all those very big demands, and we can't thank you enough and think it's really spectacular. That's my...
Very, very good.
Before I pray, you want to say anything more?
No.
Any other good words?
I mean, I'm just so thankful for everyone here, and thank you so much for
And
all
for
of
the
your work.
teams that have advised him, you know, and as our chief resident historians, we're really grateful to you for advising him too. So let me pray. Lord, take us on the following journey to wrap this project up, to open the hearts of our congregation, our alumni, our surrounding community, to see the beauty of your miracle, of your faithfulness to this church and spreading the word of Christ for over 150 years now. Take us down the right path to publish this, to let people know about this. We still need a lot of your help in the following days, months, to bring us to the right ending of this journey and give Jayway all the strength and wisdom and all the right people to end this project and publish it. So we just give you praise and glory for the miracle of having JY here as our historian. And we thank you. We thank you so much, oh Jesus, for your faithfulness. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you very much.